Good morning and welcome to the Deanery at Canterbury Cathedral on the Tuesday morning, the 9th of November, as we gather from right across the world to say our morning prayers. We've been following day by day the agenda of the COP26 Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, which is now on its 9th day and will end at the end of this week. And the agenda today gives the topic the exploration of how women are disproportionately impacted by climate change and the importance of their leadership. It's talking about gender equality in climate action, and for the ease of reference in this short broadcast of morning prayer, I shall be speaking in binary language, and so if that offends some, I apologize. So we are talking then about the way in which the voices of all can be heard with an equality, and the resources of all will help the decisions made by that equality. Let's begin our prayers then on this morning. O Lord, open our lips, and our mouth shall proclaim your praise. Your faithful servants bless you. They make known the glory of your kingdom. Blessed are you, sovereign God, ruler and judge of all. To you be praise and glory forever. In the darkness of this age that is passing away, may the light of your presence, which the saints enjoy, surround our steps as we journey on. May we reflect your glory this day, and so be made ready to see your face in the heavenly city, where night shall be no more. Blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Blessed be God forever. The night has passed, and the day lies open before us. Let us pray with one heart and mind. And as we rejoice in the gift of this new day, so may the light of your presence, O God, set our hearts on fire with love for you, now and forever. Amen. We've come to a particular position in the Deanery, right on top of the North Tower, so that we can look around the city, where traffic is beginning the city's work as we make our prayers this morning and can pray for the city. But what we see around us in Canterbury are places of education. And they're places of education where gender of all kinds are accepted within the context of that education. There is a freedom. We are looking at two universities here. The University of Kent in Canterbury on the hill on that side, which I can see very well from where I'm sitting, and the Christchurch Canterbury University on this side, taking its name from Christchurch here, the cathedral. This is very much a university which was founded on the same foundation as this cathedral here, and is one of the Anglican Episcopal universities of the world. But around us are the buildings of our own cathedral school, the King's School Canterbury. There's also the choir house, which belongs to well, the house belongs to us, but the boys who are our choristers who live there are educated at St Edmund's School up on the hill, which I can see when I'm sitting at the piano in the drawing room in the Deanery, because the city is like a basin, and all around us are the hills with the trees you can see this morning. But there's one particular place that I do want to mention this morning. First of all, perhaps we should look across at the pepperpot towers of the old gatehouse of the St Augustine's Monastery, now part of our King's School, and with girls and boys' houses over there, because many are boarders here. But also behind me here, a new house, the newest of our houses in this way, which used to be the Diocesan Painsmith School, and before that simply named after Robert Painsmith, who was a predecessor of mine was dean here from 1870 to 1895, and he had a vision for girls' education as well as boys. And the school, which he had the vision to found in that way, where equal numbers would come, became the Payne-Smith School. When I came, it was the Diocesan Payne-Smith School, and then through amalgamation with other schools and a new building, it ceased to be a school and was in danger of being bought up for housing development and everything else there. And so we bought it and brought it back again into the Cathedral Foundation and created there a girls' house, a boarding house, which lost the name, we'll go back to Robert Payne-Smith when we're reflecting, but lost the name of Payne-Smith, but at the same time gained the name, the first name, of a woman to be attached to one of the houses here. And that name is Lady Kingsdown House. Now, Rose Kingsdown is one of the great visionary people of our county, hugely respected, and was, when I came here, her husband Robin was the Lord Lieutenant, Rose was a governor of the King's School, but after his death, she has kept a prime place in the vision and activities of this county, and it was a wonderful thing that we could name the school after her, because her vision for girls' education was always shining bright and still is, and I know that she's a member of our garden congregation, so we thank her this morning for all that she has done for this vision of gender equality in this, to give that voice, because education is so much part of that voice, and the education of girls and boys in these schools and in these universities, intensely important. So let's go first, though, to our reading and our psalm, and then we will explore a little bit of that, and then come back to the agenda for the COP26 delegates as they work on through, we hope, with the same kind of vision for gender equality the world over, giving people a voice so that the decisions can be balanced and good ones. Our psalm this morning is Psalm 46 for this 9th morning of the month. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be moved, and though the mountains tremble in the heart of the sea, though the waters rage and swell, and though the mountains quake at the towering seas. There is a river, whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place of the dwelling of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, therefore shall she not be removed. God shall help her at the break of day. The nations are in uproar, and the kingdoms are shaken, but God utters his voice, and the earth shall melt away. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Come and behold the works of the Lord, what destruction he has wrought upon the earth. He makes wars to cease in all the world. He shatters the bow and snaps the spear and burns the chariots in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. So we return to the people's journey in the wilderness in the book of Exodus. Yesterday we saw how the bread of heaven, the manna, came down with the morning dew and needed to be gathered early each morning. We continue that story today, but a different kind of hand is writing it, and we can talk about that at the end of reading this passage. I'm starting at verse 22 of chapter 16. On the 6th day, the people gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each, And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find manna in the field. For 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain, each of you in their place. Let no one go out of their place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. Now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna for 40 years, till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now an omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Now, this shows a very different kind of handwriting, as the story is committed to words and a certain kind of, shall we call it, liturgical regularity. Here is a priestly hand writing with liturgical instruction. You and I might wonder how any of that was possible in the confusion of the wilderness and the gathering of a completely different kind of foodstuff, the bread of heaven, as the psalmist calls it. But this manna, which means we don't know what it is really, what is it? This manna became the staple food. And see how Moses says bake it, boil it, and use it. But now another set of instructions start coming in, and they are liturgical instructions. They are like the precentor's sheets, I've said that before, for how we worship in the cathedral, in a settled habitation. Now, a tabernacle, a tent, will be constructed as they travel in the wilderness, and they will carry that with them and set it up. We'll come to all those parts of the story, but at the moment they're hardly through the Red Sea before they start grumbling, and at that point they begin to discover there are new kinds of foodstuffs which the Lord provides, the quails and the manna. And now a hand steps forward and says how the liturgical, the instructions for worship began to develop. It's a parallel line, if you like. But what we've got there, first of all, is the holiness of the Sabbath. Now, the strict keeping of the Sabbath with all kinds of regulations became one of the points of huge tension between Jesus and those who insisted that it be kept in every dot and little tittle, as we call it, of the law. And in synagogue in his own Galilee, in the earliest of the Gospels, in St. Mark's, it's there, the Sabbath, that the tension starts to rise. And Jesus always says, again and again, in his loyalty to the law, his own loyalty to the day of rest, his loyalty to the honouring of the one he called Father, on that day, the Sabbath. But he always gave the lesson that the Sabbath, the rest, was created for the benefit and welfare of humankind, all of humankind. Let's say all its diversity in the work they're called to do needs rest, so that in taking up the work again, then work is done with more energy, more intention, because of that day of rest, and also the putting of everything into a spiritual dimension. Remember the tenets of the life of this place when it was a Benedictine monastery and still undergirding our life. The honouring of a community in body, mind and soul. But those who kept the Benedictine monastery knew perfectly well that work had to be done on the day of rest to keep the creatures fed and watered, to keep any out of danger who were in dangerous places. And all of that comes as part of ordinary life. I'm sure Jesus was used to the fact, and he mentions all these little stories about which of you would have an ox or a donkey falling into a pit and not on the Sabbath day choose to rescue him. And are you saying to me that I can't heal this person who has been bound by whatever disease or infliction has been given to their body or their mind on the Sabbath day? The Sabbath day was made for humankind. And then he establishes with his favourite phrase, meaning heaven's incarnation of all humankind, the Son of Man, he calls it. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That's a very strong statement. But it actually rests on the fact that everything on the Sabbath day was created for not only the honouring of the Creator, but also the welfare of humankind in a day of rest. That's the first principle. But here the nuts and bolts of the law start to come into that story as it's written down, probably hundreds of years later. But it became the tenets of faith of that community which was set up in a habitable place. But in the journey in the wilderness, that Sabbath was kept. But it was of benefit to all. And so more manna was gathered and probably boiled and baked on the day before the day of rest. And everyone the next day had to keep the day of rest. The same kind of question marks came when that society which they formed in the habitable land, not too many hundreds of years before Jesus himself was living in that land, when Mattathias and his sons had to say, well, do we fight against those who are threatening our law, our faith and everything else on the Sabbath? Or do we, as some of our brothers and sisters have done, simply become absolutely still and refuse to fight because it's not honouring the Sabbath and become annihilated? Hard questions. But they make a choice to resist for the sake of the faith which gives them the day of rest and the honouring of the Creator in the sanctuary. Well, that takes me then to the next point of the keeping of the omer of manna in the pot. And that was a solemn covenant that pot, it was thought, was kept in the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, when the temple itself was established, together with the tablets of the law and Aaron's rod which flowers. And in that Ark of the Covenant, only the high priest, of course, goes into the Holy of Holies at that time. It's, I think, believed by most that when the Temple of Solomon was destroyed with the invasion, when the Jews were again taken into exile, and we were looking at the way in which Ezekiel was dealing with that exile hundreds of years later, that was destroyed. And probably by the time of the temple that was nearing the end of its construction, Herod the Great's temple at the time of Jesus, that was no longer the case. But it was still very much part of what the people believed, and those representations of their time in the wilderness, the manna, the tablets of stone, which we haven't come to yet, and Aaron's rod itself, Aaron's staff itself, became symbols and signs of what is going on. And the holiness of all that then gets attached to the transportable tabernacle, the tent, which is often called, in the wilderness as they travel. These are at the moment a traveling, journeying, wayfaring community. And you could go back to that hymn which we used yesterday of strangers and pilgrims, and still seeking the city of God. Well, the city of God for them became the holy mountain of Zion later on, but the image of the city of God is for all nations, as we saw. And then we have that extraordinary little explanation, as though it's given to us who are not understanding, right at the end. They ate the manna for 40 years until they came to a habitable land, and ate it until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And then in parenthesis, in most translations, you get an omer is the 10th part of an ephah, which is a really sort of an explanation of weights and measures at that time. As though someone is saying, looking back through all those years, now let me not let you be confused, an omer is a 10th part of an ephah. I remember it at the end of a Dean's conference in the St Albans diocese, and we were eating at Hatfield that night, and one of the canons, a humorist at St Albans Cathedral at that time, this is years ago, was asked to say grace, and we had that lesson read in course at Evensong, and he said a marvellous grace, praying for anything, everything, and giving thanks for this, thanks for that, and he ended, and that an omer is a 10th part of an ephah, we give thanks. And everyone laughed and thought that this priestly hand putting in the explanation is there giving the lesson for us to receive, that signs of the past are important, but they are signs which serve humankind, rather, as Jesus said, the Sabbath must serve humankind. And at that point, perhaps I'm going to bend down. We've got Lilly here with us this morning. Hello, little girl. Here we are. I'm going to give you something, or rather, yeah, I know, it's not very nice up here, is it? It's rainy and wet, but never mind, you can have something here just to cheer you up a little bit. There we are. So let's go then to everything that is being discussed in terms of exploring how women across the world are disproportionately impacted by climate change, and the importance of women's leadership and imagination in a different perspective because of the jobs that they find themselves, particularly in poorer communities across the world, forced to do to care for the family. And that intention is hindered by the fact of not owning the land and not having economic resources to help themselves very often when the land is struck with drought and they are not able to be part of the decision making. And these things are being addressed by the COP26 intention that all should have a right, first of all, to education, equality of education for all, gender equality. And we're knowing that throughout the world, I've seen this over and over again, working in Tanzania, and we're praying for the Diocese of Northern Highlands in Tanzania in our prayers for the communion this morning. But working there in southern Tanzania, very often the ones who do the work in the fields are the women themselves, planning it, planting it, finding the water to water the plantings, digging out the runnels in order that the food shall be provided for family life, and at the same time keeping, we talked about the woman with the chicken farm yesterday who, when it kept flooding, turned to keeping ducks instead, being innovative. And at the same time, to be really innovative, you need both economic power, but also to be part of the decision-making bodies about the landscape and about what kind of changes need to be made and what kind of adaptations, we're back on that again, adaptations need to be effected in order that things can happen. The enormous increase in flooding, the enormous increase in droughts across the world, and transforming the species of crops which need to be grown, the enormous increase in wildfires, but also the way in which burning particular types of fuel increases the climatic instability and is not helping at all to reduce that climate, that warming of the earth down, sorry, and down once again to 1.5 degrees, by 1.5 degrees, down to that point, so that we're reducing only a little bit what is happening. But as we saw yesterday, people across the world are having to deal with that now. And in so many ways, let's go back to that patriarchal society we've been talking about. I wonder who gathered most of the manna. And I wonder also who gathered the fuel. But most of all, we've seen who is sent out to get the water from the well. Oftentimes a long journey to seek for water sources. That is very often still the absolute task of women, to go out. And often the walking through these areas causes them to be in particular kinds of vulnerable situations. But the carrying of water, and some walk miles to find water, and sometimes water is unavailable. And so all of these things to keep family life going become hugely important, that in adapting the minds of those who go out to find water, who go out to find fuel, and come back and light that fuel, and bake and boil, and provide the meals for the family. And in so many societies, that is still massively the job of women, to go out and do that. But quite often in those same societies, the women have no right to own the land where they're developing all of that, nor do they have independent economic resources of their own if something desperate in terms of climatic change or a storm or a fire destroys things, to put things right, or to make decisions which will say, if we transform this piece of land into that, then those kind of things won't happen and the family can be protected. Of course it's a job for all genders, but at this moment we don't have gender equality in decision making or resource holding, and that's what this is about today. We're finding, and I remember so well, the work of the Mothers Union, both in Sudan and in Tanzania and in Zimbabwe, going there, all across there, and it's real physical and very often dangerous work, taking food into prisons, taking food into hospitals when it's not provided, and going there as teams. And yet at the same time, very often the councils and decisions are made without that gender diversity and equality of voice, so that all experiences are known, valued, treasured, and go into the decisions that are being made. That's what this is all about today. Just getting the right voices round the table. Those who realise that there are easy ways with solar power to create light. And the way in which that the women of those lands that I've been talking about are learning that, but you learn it through education. So, although 51% of the global population women. They make up a very small percentage of landowners, and cash and credit to buy tools aren't available for so many of them. They also, in so many societies, have reduced access to education or possibly no education at all offered, and are much more vulnerable to environmental and climatic changes in all the tasks that they have to do. They don't, as I've said, they don't have land, don't have the land they work on, and so that freedom of resource is not there for them. So this is a day about honouring women's choices so that they can make decisions for themselves, not just in rural areas but in cities too, because they see in looking after the families exactly what kind of requirements there are. And this is so often done, of course, by all genders together in that family. But so often in different societies, that's not yet been achieved, and neither has equality of education. So that scarcity of food becomes one of the things that we're talking about today. Adaptation, we're still talking about. Resilience, and women have to be resilient for their children, resilient when they are in pregnancy, resilient and kept out of danger and resourced properly in health terms. All of those become a huge concern. It's a concern for all of us. We're talking about gender equality, but at the same time, different insights come from different places, and the voice has to be one which is a collective voice, so that norms and traditions and policies which exclude voices are not helpful when those voices actually have the real realization about what the answer, the effective answer to adapting and finding that resilience and that transformation, or also the ways in which society and land can be protected from the desperate dangers they're in. At the same time, the sense of home is one that is totally precious to the family. And climate-induced migration, having to leave home, is something very foreign to those who want to create home where they've always been. But they have to be given the chance to make the right decisions and given the right resources to stay in that place, and not to have to wander because of everything that's going on and the choices not being able to be made. All of those things we've added in clips again that you can look into after we finished with the blessing this morning, and just see. There's a wonderful one where the former Irish President Mary Robinson is interviewed, and she says in that, "I want to emphasize very strongly how important it is that we have women's leadership on climate change, and I mean women's leadership at all levels." Well, I think I've tried to make that point enough. Let's go back to Robert Payne Smith, whose portrait hangs in the drawing room down below, and he was, as I said, the dean here from 1870 to 1895, but had a vision for the education of women. He also had a vision when the Lambeth Conference was happening. In those days it was held at Lambeth with far fewer bishops, and all of them travelling back to here. He had a vision to bring them all down here and make this place a focus for all the nations of the communion, which were growing and growing. And now, of course, we're preparing for one in July of next year and August, when representatives of all the nations where an Anglican bishop is will be here, either physically or maybe some online, in order to make the right decisions. And that gender equality is beginning to be a factor in that as well. One remembers that Robert Payne Smith, who came from Gloucestershire, as I do, was educated at Chipping Campden Grammar School, but he learned Hebrew, and he was a fine Hebrew scholar, but also was a scholar in Sanskrit too, and an Orientalist. But he learned Hebrew from his sister Esther, teaching him at home. And I think that at home caused him to think, but Esther is far cleverer than I am. and she's a wonderful teacher, and then gave him that vision for gender equality in all education. So thanks be to God for him, and thanks be to God for all those who have a vision for that voice of gender equality the world over in climate change, because it can do nothing but good in decision making. From where I'm sitting, I can look across at the roof of the old palace, which is the Archbishop's home when he comes here, the Archbishop and Caroline Welby. And I wanted to mention Caroline in her very significant and independent ministry to the women of the Anglican Communion, and particularly the spouses of primates and bishops throughout the world, so that when they gather here in Canterbury next year for the Lambeth Conference in July and in August, many of them hopefully physically and others maybe online, she will have almost an independent ministry to uphold the torch of what we've been talking about this morning and give that voice a real underlining. But we admire her courage and the way in which the energy takes her across the world in so many different ways, and just as we've thanked her, we also return, if I point down to it, we've got here behind me the building of what was the Painsmith Diocesan School, named after Robert Painsmith, and now Lady Kingsdown House. It's not the first girls' house, but other girls' houses in this now equal numbers of boys and girls at our cathedral school, our King's School, Canterbury, that now the girls' houses tended to take over boys' houses which had been founded with the names of men in the past. This is the very first one that was founded as a girls' house and bears Lady Kingsdown's name, and that also is a torch for the equality of all genders in education, and the choice that we want to give to all, to equal opportunities in education. Below, just there, you see the gardener's cottage there, but just along here is the little gate which goes through the ancient wall into the Painsmith School, as it was, Lady Kingsdown House there, because later on, other deans which followed on from Robert Painsmith would go in there to teach when it was a primary school. And also, and people still have stories about this, that the little children would come in with their teachers and be on the lawn and be entertained there and perhaps play little games, because there's not much land attached to that particular place. Now, of course, there are plentiful playing fields and everything else, because Lady Kingsdown House belongs to the whole foundation with all its sports fields and opportunities that goes with it. So it's become a little torch with that. Just in front, out of interest, you're seeing next to the deanery cottage there, the little tomato house, which we were sitting in yesterday, being prepared now to be a protective space for some of the turkeys and chickens in the winter. And beyond, the big greenhouse and the little greenhouse, where we were talking, in the big greenhouse, we were talking about succulents yesterday before we went on to the Bastion garden. And then in the little greenhouse at the moment, we've got Lizzie and her poults, and also the tortoises and hedgehogs and everything else, just to locate you as we sit up here on this quite nice morning now, with the cloud beginning to break up. This is a massive topic, but it shows how much prayer is needed for the intricate decisions that those delegates in Glasgow have to make on this, the 9th morning of their conference, and the days are gradually running out for decisions to be made. Let's say then our prayers on this day. I've already said that we're praying for the Diocese of the Northern Highlands in Tanzania, and we're thinking of all life there. And as we remember this diocese, and this diocese, we pray for Archbishop Justin and Caroline this morning, and also Bishop Rose of Dover and Bishop Emma at Lambeth. The diocese has a strapline this morning on 9th of November. You remember, we're not praying parish by parish. And the strapline is, "This includes you." Well, we might say that, and you know, I point to myself as well. All that we've been saying includes me, to learn lessons on the way through. Going back to Robert Painsmith, when he died in 1895, he chose to be buried up at St. Martin's Church, which I can just see in the distance, which was the church that Queen Bertha used long before Augustine came here, because she came as a princess of the Frankish nation and was already Christian when she came here and brought her priests to celebrate with her there. In the old Roman church, which went back farther, so St. Martin's Church on the hill there, where Robert Payne Smith is buried, is actually the oldest church in the English-speaking world, and that's a lovely thing to think of as I look across the trees here. It's shrouded a little bit for me by the leaves of the trees, but that's a lovely thing too, thinking of that Queen Bertha's Way, the Queen's Way, which you can walk down and through the Queen's Gate, which then leads into the Dean's Walk or across the Memorial Garden. So, Lily's come back. Hello. Let's say then the prayer for this particular day, the third Sunday before Advent is the collect we're using, and bring your own prayers from right across the world, your own intentions and anything that has been stirred within you. Remember the diocesan strapline, this includes you. Almighty Father, whose will it is to restore all things in your beloved Son, the King of all, govern the hearts and minds of those in authority, and bring the families of the nations, divided and torn apart by the ravages of sin, to be subject to his just and gentle rule, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So we say the prayer our Saviour taught us in whatever language you like to use. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen. Moment of silence now for our reflection this morning. Lily loves coming up high here, and this morning this is a great treat for her, but she's an interesting character. She lives in rather a male household with Leo and Tiger and formerly Otto and Monkey, and then Fletcher and me, but there's no doubt in anyone's mind who is in charge of the house when she uses all kinds of methods to make absolutely sure that she's the one who calls the shots. And here she is today, just reminding me that maybe something needs to be happening downstairs as well. So let's end with our blessing. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you, upon those whom you love, and upon those whom you would pray for, today and always. Amen. Right, we have actually finished. We can go downstairs now if you like to. What we're not going to do is leave you up here, which has happened before. Find yourself on the roof, which you haven't minded particularly, have you? Everything is an excitement. Yes. Okay, let's go. Come on.
I want to emphasize very strongly how important it is that we have women's leadership on climate change. And I mean women's leadership at all levels. Women at grassroots who are faced with the shocks of climate change, which do have different impacts on the lives of men and women, boys and girls. The impact on women is usually much more severe. If there is prolonged drought, if she has to go further for firewood, if there is flooding, she has to cope with the problems of food, the problems of keeping the family together. And if she's a farmer, we know the impact on poor subsistence farmers of the fact that weather is much less predictable. There are weather shocks, there are no seasons. We're seeing it all over Africa. It's something that has been focused on very much by Africa itself under the leadership of South Africa in holding meetings to focus on the gender dimensions. So we have an opportunity, if we link the leadership of women at grassroots, their wisdom, their knowledge, their coping mechanisms, their need for more money and resources for adaptation. If we link this with the fact that more and more women are ministers, have access to the negotiating tables, have access to the important meetings where decisions are being taken. And it is their responsibility and our endeavours in that regard that there will be a decision at every level on gender, whether it is on mitigation, on adaptation, on transfer of technologies, on financing, on legal form of a new climate agreement. It's important that we make progress on that. We won't get a final result in Durban, but we have to make progress towards that final result, because that's important also for the negative impacts that climate can have, and also working towards Rio +20, the importance of access to affordable, renewable energy. That too has a strong gender dimension. And if we can really show our strengths as women leaders in Durban, we will change the narrative. We will genuinely change the debate on climate change itself, and we will make it a much more practical solution in the future.
From rising sea levels to agricultural shortfalls and urban floods, the world is feeling the effects of climate change. The impact is particularly acute for women, who make up a large number of the poor communities that depend on natural resources for their livelihood. With such strong ties to the environment, women have the knowledge and skills to be key agents for building resilience and supporting low-emission development. Successful action on climate change depends on engaging women as stakeholders and planners, and ensuring that both women and men can access and control the resources they need to adapt to and mitigate climate change. Gender equality and women's empowerment are vital to UNDP's work. UNDP is on the ground supporting partners to engage women in climate change adaptation and mitigation. UNDP is supporting improved access for women to climate information, water resources, and climate-resilient farming practices. With new harvesting techniques and improved production and processing methods, women are increasing their income, gaining financial independence, and taking on more leadership roles in their community. UNDP has supported pilot initiatives in Africa and Asia that are training rural women to install and use cleaner cook stoves that use less wood than traditional stoves, reducing time needed to search for firewood. UNDP and partners helped train women to build and create off-grid solar power units, providing clean, inexpensive electricity to poor communities. Similarly, UNDP's innovative project of creating reservoirs and embankments have helped to cultivate fish and vegetables. As a result, the communities have enough food and increase in income. The world's response to climate change must ensure that women and men benefit equally and have opportunities in the new green economy.
Climate change is not neutral. It's not going to affect all of us equally. Who you are, where you live, how much money you make, the strength of your community, many different factors determine how you'll be impacted. And climate change is definitely not gender neutral, and neither are some of the solutions to climate change.
Gender inequity is a global problem steeped in long-held cultural attitudes, laws, and institutions. And it's many of those ideas and structures that contribute the most to environmental impacts. So it isn't that surprising that there's a strong relationship between gender and climate change.
That's Charlie from the YouTube channel Our Changing Climate. He makes video essays about the environment and how we interact with it, and he's here today to help me explore ecofeminism and the gendered aspects of climate change. Now, if I put on my SJW hat for a second and say that gender is essentially made up and how we present and move through the world is essentially determined by where we grew up and what our parents and friends said that we are, and if the whole world recognized that individuals are individuals and that our sex does not determine our value in the world, well, then we wouldn't be having this problem. But as it is, in many cultures and places, men and women are treated really differently. Quick aside, I apologize to my non-binary friends out there. Most of the research in this field looks at gender exclusively as a binary, which sucks and obviously means a lot of people are falling through the cracks. Gender inequality has a lot of ramifications, but looking at agriculture is one of the easiest ways to see how the impacts of climate change are gendered.
Despite making up 51% of the global population, women make up only a small percentage of landholders, and they often have less access than men to cash and credit to buy necessary tools, fertilizers, and seeds. Compounded with reduced access to education, outside funding, or co-ops, women are more vulnerable than men to environmental and climatic changes.
For example, if you don't own the land that you work on or you don't have cash in hand, a drought is going to hit you really hard. You may lose access to the area that you're farming, or you might not be able to replant this season or next, and you might not be able to recover. Improving the livelihood of women farmers and closing what is often called the agricultural gender gap will provide not only deeply needed support for women, but may also reduce emissions. Women make up about 43% of the agricultural workforce in developing countries, but because of all those things that Charlie mentioned, on average, women produce less from the same amount of land as men. Now, this isn't because women aren't capable farmers, not at all. Providing women with access to the same resources as men can increase their yields 20 to 30%, providing food to up to 150 million people who are hungry. And here's where the possible emissions reductions come in. As it currently stands, with half the population underfunded and or actively repressed, areas that could provide plenty of resources, like food, don't. This leads to pressure for further land development, so people start going out looking for more places to farm. This can lead to deforestation, which is a large driver of emissions.
Part of closing that agricultural gender gap will rely on women having access to better education. But beyond that, research has shown that educating women is the single most important social and economic factor associated with a reduction in vulnerability to environmental disasters. The number one thing that reduces the impact of disasters is educating women. And not just the impact of disasters on women, but on everyone. That's a huge deal, because climate change is intensifying environmental disasters like cyclones, forest fires, droughts, and floods.
But what exactly does education mean here? Is it like special courses or best practices? In this context and much of the research in this area, education means level of educational attainment. So that stat that Charlie just mentioned, that education is one of the single biggest factors in reducing vulnerability, that looks at the number of women who have reached secondary or higher levels of schooling. So my brain, that means high school. Your mileage may differ based on where you live and how they label schooling. Educating women also improves economic outcomes through access to jobs and greater upward mobility. It improves health outcomes, decreasing the number of women who die in childbirth, improving infant mortality and disease risk. And educating more women, it'll also help us reduce emissions.
Education goes hand in hand with voluntary family planning. When women have access to the information to choose when and how to have a family, it improves health outcomes and life expectancy of women and children.
And family planning programs lead to women having fewer children overall, which means fewer people contributing to carbon emissions. However, before we go barreling into that whole can of worms, it's important to acknowledge that hundreds of millions of women around the world want the access to that education and those family planning programs, as well as the tools to prevent pregnancy.
Family planning programs, importantly, need to be voluntary to honor the right of women to choose what they want their own lives to look like. And we're not just talking about some high fancy US horse over here. The US is notorious for our poor sex education. And here, something like 45% of pregnancies are unintended. Providing women around the globe with better family planning is wanted and needed. And it has the added benefit of reducing emissions.
So to wrap this all up, environmental and climate impacts are gendered because of societal and cultural structures. To change that, we need to provide women with access to the education and resources so that they get to make decisions themselves about how they make money, how they feed themselves and their families, and what their families look like. This also means including women when structuring climate or environmental, and frankly, any policies. But it also means that we should more often be looking at the problem of global climate change in a gendered way. Asking questions like, how do climatic changes impact a crop that's predominantly farmed by women? Or do women in this area have access to the resources to survive, say, a massive flood?
One possible framework for answering those questions is ecofeminism, which uses a feminist lens to examine the relationship between the natural world and the oppression of women. Over on my channel, we ask the questions, what is ecofeminism, and is it a useful lens for understanding our current social and environmental circumstances?
It's a great video and a perfect part 2 to inform this more practical discussion of gender and climate with loftier academic and theoretical ideas. It also kind of gets at the attention of looking with a purely gendered lens. Go check out that video, subscribe to Our Changing Climate, let us know if you have any questions in the comments down below, and thank you for watching.
My name is Giulia Maci. I'm leading the Cities for Women program at Cities Alliance, and our program really focuses on making cities more inclusive towards women's need and capacity to engage more women in the city-making process. We believe that a city that is more responsive to women's need and capacity is a city that works for everyone, is better for everyone. This session, we'll do a very short session looking at the implication of gender in climate adaptation action. Climate change affects women and men differently. Extreme weather events such as droughts and floods have a greater impact on the poor and most vulnerable. We're in fact talking about feminization of poverty as we define climate adaptation responses and projects in cities. We first need to understand the underlying drivers of inequity and how they make specific groups of women, men, and poor more vulnerable to climate change. These drivers of inequity are 3. The first one is gender responsibilities and roles. Women, in fact, are often responsible for gathering and producing food, collecting water, and sourcing fuel for eating and cooking. With climate change, these tasks are becoming more difficult, limiting also opportunities for education and income generation and increasing exposure to violence, including also sexual violence. Care work, due to health impact of climate change, may also increase, putting additional burden on those who are mainly responsible for that, which are, again, women. Globally, also women produce 60% of the food, but are more likely than men to report food insecurity. As a coping strategy in the face of food scarcity, again related to climate change, women are more likely than men to reduce the amount they eat. So this is related to gender, responsibility, and roles. The second driver of inequity is health. Climate change produces conditions that propel the spread of malaria, especially flooding and high temperature. Growing evidence and data indicates that malaria has specific gender effects, which are felt mostly by poor and marginalized people. Prevalent gender inequalities also tend to get exacerbated in the wake of disasters. For example, women and girls become more vulnerable to gender-based violence, and this is the case also with the COVID-19. Domestic violence is increasing. The third driver of inequity is related to rights. So women's access to productive agricultural resources and services, for instance, is not equal to men's access. This reduces women's adaptive capacity, especially during critical climate change events. The right of women to own property, which is often denied by law or also in the current practice, is also an important requirement for post-hazard reconstruction of human settlements, owning land, owning properties, housing. Ownership or occupancy rights precludes eviction and enhance security. And in the post-hazard reconstruction phase, rebuilding as storm-resistant and gender-sensitive structures is key to create resilient cities. In Nepal right now, with UNOPS, we are leading a participatory process to collect ideas from women for the post-earthquake reconstruction in Kathmandu. So really trying to collect what do they need, how do they see their cities, and how they want to see the city of the future. Adaptation measures and responses needs to take into account these drivers of inequality, which are gendered roles and responsibilities, rights, and health, which in themselves make adaptation less effective. So every project and actions need to challenge, for instance, gender norms, responsibilities, and roles. Looking at health access, so trying to put the most marginalized at the center of these responses. Looking at rights, how laws are defined and how the laws are put in practice. Access to land is key. There are examples of initiatives that also we are conducting at the moment together with our partners and members that try to apply an equity lens to enable women, youth, and ethnic groups to lead efforts also to adapt to climate change. For example, in Liberia, we have gathered women's ideas and needs through dedicated participatory process related to the formulation of the city development strategies. We engage women from different groups and to got their priorities, needs, and we include them into the formulation of the plan. Then we are also starting now a process of construction of water kiosks in 2 informal communities, and we are again engaging women's group in the co-design process, in the construction, and later on they will be really in charge of the maintenance and management of the water kiosk. So gender is a key component of these initiatives, empowering women to take on leading roles in water committees as their time is no longer burdened by water gathering. But just I wanted to underline what are the 3 elements that for me are key to take into consideration when we are going to develop projects related to community, gender, and climate adaptation. So resilience requires data. Gender statistics and sex disaggregated data also provide evidence necessary to assess gender gaps across all areas of urban life, including also linkages between these areas, which form the basis of gender inequalities. Limitations in available data still exist with a lack of qualitative data. Questioning quantitative data from a gender perspective with the use of perceptions of qualitative data helps to interpret better the statistics. Cities Alliance has developed recently and tested already a toolkit that combine numbers and quantitative data with perception, story, qualitative responses to understand women's engagement in city development, looking at space, politics, culture, and economy. And I invite you to have a look to this toolkit because there are different methods and approaches you can also use in your projects. So data are important, sex disaggregated data, qualitative data are important. The second aspect is really the participatory approach, design and implement action with women, really engaging them, giving them a voice. So it's important to recognize the contributions of women as decision makers, stakeholders, educators, experts across different sectors in the city. They can lead their participation to successful long-term solutions to climate change. Women have proven to be leading the way towards more sustainable solutions to climate change across sector, women's innovations, expertise, also community leadership. They are really engaged in their community. We could see that also during the COVID situation, no? To be able to reach out the poor, the community, we needed to go through and engage women because they knew better what were the needs. There are still patriarchal norms, gender stereotypes, as I said, gender roles that limit women's capacity to act. So we really need, through our project, to empower women in this sense, give them the possibility to really have a say. The third is connecting action on the ground with advocacy. So everything that you do, trying to use the stories also of your project, the results, to change policy making at the city level, at your neighborhood level, or if it's possible, national level, globally. And we need to establish dialogues with institutions and key stakeholders to show how gender equality matters in climate change actions in cities. The important thing when we start a project, when we start an action, is to ask to ourselves who matters, who decides, and who benefits. And of course, the right answer to all these questions is, of course, everyone. So everyone matters when it comes to managing the impacts of climate change, and particularly those who are least able to adapt. Thank you.
Why gender matters for effective adaptation to climate change. The impacts of climate change, including seasonal changes, sea level rise, and extreme weather events, are already affecting people's lives in both subtle and devastating ways. Adaptation to climate change is the process of building the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies to these impacts. It requires action at all levels, from individuals, governments, and the international community. For adaptation to be effective, it's important to recognize that the impacts of climate change affect different people in different ways. How they are affected depends on where they live and how they earn their livelihoods. In many contexts, it also depends on their gender. Women, men, and non-binary people often play different roles in their households and communities. They also have different access to resources and opportunities. These differences influence their vulnerability to climate risks, as well as their capacity to prepare for and manage the impacts. Women and non-binary people are often at a disadvantage as they face barriers in realizing their rights due to norms, traditions, and policies that perpetuate gender inequality. Other forms of discrimination, for example, based on race, being indigenous, or having a disability, also play a role in making some people more vulnerable than others to the same climate impacts. This means we can't look at gender in isolation. A gender-responsive approach is intersectional, recognizing that people have multiple identities that shape their experiences. A gender-responsive approach focuses on three things: who matters, who decides, and who benefits. The answer to the question of who matters is, of course, everyone. Everyone matters when it comes to managing the impacts of climate change. This means that investments in adaptation must be designed to meet different needs, taking into account people's gender and their social status. When it comes to who decides, we must consider who is typically excluded from planning and decision-making. A gender-responsive approach brings diverse voices to the table, recognizing the value of their knowledge and their potential as agents of change. Without careful attention to gender and social dynamics, there is a risk that adaptation investments actually reinforce existing inequalities in wealth and power structures, rather than benefiting the most vulnerable people. Adaptation is effective when it is equitable, providing opportunities and benefits for all people. Governments, private sector actors, civil society organizations, and communities around the world are ramping up efforts to respond to the impacts of climate change. We have an opportunity to ensure that these efforts also generate progress towards gender equality. To make this happen, we need a gender-responsive approach to adaptation. This is the only way we can build families, communities, and societies that are resilient to the impacts of climate change.
Farmers overwhelmingly, I think, are noticing changes in their environment. They're noticing milder winters. That's the number one observation that I hear. Winters are becoming milder. There are changes in precipitation. The growing season is changing. And in fact, if we look at the climatological scenarios and the climatological data that we have, farmers' perceptions are very much in line with what's happening climatologically. So they know, they understand what's happening. I grew up on a farm myself. I spent my childhood doing a lot of the things that rural farm kids do. I learned to value the environment. I spent a lot of time outside. I grew up with an understanding of the importance of the environment around me. And so I think in many ways that has really caused me to pay attention and to want to do research that is about environment and climate. I also grew up watching the incredible contributions that women were making to the community where I grew up. As a researcher, my interest is in bringing those contributions to light, in looking at those contributions and looking at how important those contributions are in the event of climate extremes. So when people are dealing with floods and droughts, what are women contributing? Farming here in Canada is still seen very much as a masculine profession. And because of men's sort of closeness to the livestock, to the crops, they have, in fact, a large amount of emotional and psychological vulnerability when that farm is threatened. In light of impending climate change and the floods and the droughts that we can expect to see, the kind of work that women are doing, not only in terms of their labor, but also in terms of their emotional labor, will become very important as well. And so the women that I talk to, when I ask them about, tell me about that drought you experienced, or tell me about that flood that you went through on the farm, they'll say things like, well, I was the supporter, I was the buffer, I was holding everybody together emotionally. And I think it's really important not only to pay attention to, in this case, men's vulnerability when the farm fails and the livestock are suffering and the crop is dying, but also at the same time to recognize that we need to support the people who are supporting everybody else. And in many cases, that's women.
On a Saturday morning across Fiji, local markets are filled to capacity with fresh produce from its lush environment. Local eggplants, coriander, pineapple, watermelons and other vegetables line the stalls in local markets. In particular, this vegetable, the ota, has been prepared for sale by the women of Nassau and has travelled kilometres from the interior of Tailevu to be sold in the market today for $1 a bundle. In the Pacific Islands, the marketplace system is the way of life for many women who earn essential cash income for the survival of their families. The journey of this vegetable begins in the highlands of Tailevu in the village of Nassau. Nestled in the thick vegetation in the province of Tailevu, the village of Nassau is just a 2-hour drive from Suva City. Yet, there's no electricity in the village, and women play an active role in providing for their families through the marketplace system. The first half of this journey begins with the women of Nassau rising before sunrise and feeding their families, then making the long winding trek through thick vegetation to harvest this green fern called ota to sell at city or town markets for their income. This is what is commonly known as mbasa, derived from the word bazaar.
Jin kanton dana kalok se bulan sinkarwa penangai lesmaina mena pangawata ngonan ronyota galo lavatana ika ngona miti ganli vakanga me buki va tokona kata me buki dana kena tinituna Chasa melo kansara. Do talita mo limbasa na aundo na nungela la ulimbasa. Do na kaya na koro. Na songo se dabe vadore na do sini do la na basa.
The practice of mbasa is often passed on to women and girls in successive generations of the family, with no prospect of improved conditions or more secure incomes. The women of Nassau travel treacherous bush tracks and spend hours harvesting and preparing their cash crops. Then it's another early morning start in the cold, dark and thick fog of Tailevu. This truck starts its pickup route at Nassau. Children are wrapped in warm clothes in anticipation of the open vehicle ride. One truck to at least 9 to 10 men, women and children, plus their cargo, is a death trap. Space is limited and the young men are reduced to stand on the back of the truck and grab the rails for support for 2 to 3 hours in the cold.
Daw bitamay na matakalilay. Rua na kaloko, kina bimani rua kim sando babaraw. Wara kana kala lori na tola kaloko mi kim mi pando mai. Doktor kim mi na rua kina tolu na awa. Doktor ni kim mi lewalu. Kim mi do pando mai kim so mana pando ni lori na la komai na bi mazawa. Kim do so me rusonga bulu. Bazaar rusong bulan dolar kira tol $1 bulan dolar. Dona maram. Nona ngakin lagi mekin na market. sandola bitu dola tuna makete and to making the will take in.
Rural women working as food, producer, distributor, and trader face the additional challenges of unreliable and hazardous transport arrangements, traveling often in the dark, cold, wet, and difficult hours of night, and very early morning by road, sea, river, on foot, or horseback, in bad weather, and even in times of disaster. Rural women vendors produce, distribute, and trade in fresh food products in weekly cycles, commencing mid to late week. Some plan and cooperate in village groups to overcome a multitude of supply chain problems from farm to market. The final part of the journey ends here in the marketplace, where unfortunately these women are battling inequality everywhere. Poor, dangerous and dysfunctional infrastructure, security and transport, and disaster risk and recovery that undermine vendors' guarantees of fair returns, reliability of incomes, and the realization of women's potential for economic empowerment. These women are on the brink of poverty or already in poverty. The income that they earn each day is crucial to meeting basic needs, like education for children. Market trade is the only way the rural and poor majority of Pacific Island women can earn essential cash income, but it's no easy feat. The work of trading on markets directly as producer or through reselling involves serious hardships and hazards. Very long working hours in crowded, dirty, poorly lit and ventilated spaces, water supply and toilets are barely adequate and often unreliable. Women and children brave the elements to protect their produce. It's do or die. The women of Nassau are considered rural vendors. They sell in the perimeters of the market 1 to 3 days a week, and they are not permitted membership of the vendor organizations. Poor urban women resellers are silenced by male leadership. Men employed as managers, cleaners, and fee collectors tend to bully and belittle women and often embezzle their fees. Formal and informal security guards extort protection money. Marginalized male youth, drug and alcohol affected, congregate and persuade and coerce women to donate loose cash. Rural producer vendors experience the greatest marginalization in the markets, with no option but to sell outdoors, outside and around main market shelters.
Ko kim nangai betri kim saya dan beramai, kim saya dan beramai sa sindron kim lagu itu sa songa na mata-mata ko kim sa bangarang na bunemi kim sa mo dikin so sa bolanga me sa ko taxi de kim ndanga sa bole me kim mo na market kim nanu mani me ka ko ni sa me bitu sa sindron ni bilam sa no mani ka ko na sin madala tu na tamata na la ko mai rameta tarba vitalia kim sa bolanga me kim sa mo ditu ngai tu na lada saranga kimi kote tiko mai me mai balata ni bakabalita ki kimi nga bakatiki mai mi lomani market ilom kongo kimi me daga botu me ndo mo tewira me kimi ndabota
ndo to na uda se dilo kata-kata na singa sando kim do lang kata sarna ni mami bol ke kira-kira ni bebu ke na ndo na bebu ke meron kim ba balata ki babina ka me maru na ni mami bol
na me bakani kimi tu me bana kor kimi stava na ndrenre me bakana dolo ni lotu na buli patala kina na ni mimbula ni bubale ni bale ko kimi law tu mi kino me kimi bangara kan basta patala kina soni libali
sangani bakani kim modi tiko lo mani bale iyo modi tu bai tu modi anda na tamata sin modi bina sa kerechunga virto mendo mandanga na vale baka me kim do le mode kina me kim so mai ilu kim do mode tik me na YWC ilu sin kelang ada sa sen kina
na 19 19
Locked out from the main buildings in the evenings from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., they must sleep overnight on the pavements around the market, exposed to the elements, but also having to watch over produce, and to wake early morning to compete for the strategic selling spots. Municipalities very rarely consult or plan with vendors or their representatives. Instead, they pass bylaws and rules that are top directive and intended to install authority, law and order, minimizing tension between inside and outside vendors, but also turning a blind eye to the beggars, criminals and drug and alcohol affected men who frequent markets and prevail upon women vendors to give them coins.
Na kirire nandra nintawut kolomani market na cavalo mosara. Na patapata di bonoa na simende ndo da volta na bimbongi. Do canapala do ndraki uda do stabir na marama na bimbiniang. Kosa ngandemre kero nindo na bona meramaro i baro ki na marama. Meroni ngole isuba le basa ra tiko binakar lester menakor.
Mostly my flowers, I grow them at home. My dad's place in Wanibuku. We had a farm there. Yeah, and then I get flowers from the ladies in the Wanibuku Road. I collect them when I come to the market. I hired a van, then I collect the flowers from the ladies in Wanibuku Road. It's a very hard job for us. We have to fetch our waters from inside the market, carry waters from inside and bring it outside. And otherwise we have to pay the wheelbarrow boys to fetch our waters for $2 for 3 buckets a load and get it out. And during when it's a hot sun, our flowers are usually damaged and we can't get a good sale in our flowers because we don't have a shade. And that's very hard. And during rainy weather, it's hard for us because we are in the rain selling. There's no shade here. And in the night, we sleep there to look after our flowers. There's no security provided for us from the city council. So we have to look after our own flowers in the night. And we have to sleep on the floor in the market, outside. We have to have some money. I have to look after my son.
Many women vendors have to care for their young children as they work, adding to their multitasking burden, strategies and risks. Suva Market Research in 1994 recorded an average of 400 vendors daily. In 2012, Suva City Council reports figures of 1,500 to 2,000 vendors on peak selling days. That's Fridays and Saturdays. The governance and administration of Fiji's markets has changed little over the past 5 decades. The swelling numbers of people working as market vendors is characterized by higher ratios of women vendors to men, 4:1. Women vendors are typically small and struggling operators, while men tend to consolidate their control over multiple selling spaces. The enduring commitment of thousands of poor women to these highly demanding routines for the specific purpose of earning regular cash incomes is one of the most urgent yet largely overlooked development problems of the Pacific region, and a critical entry point for poverty reduction and women's economic empowerment. Women manage their cash incomes differently to men, prioritizing the basic needs of their families and community. However, most women market vendors do not have access to saving facilities, and few have real control over their incomes. Husbands and children often press them to hand over cash, even during the working day. In the worst cases, women's failures to meet men's demand for cash, often for his leisure or pleasure, can result in him committing physical violence and verbal abuse against her. This is reported in all market surveys, suggesting it's not exceptional. At the inaugural planning workshop for UN Women's PIM project in Fiji, young male market managers referred to rural women vendors as a bunch of unruly and troublemaking women carrying a whole lot of rubbish into town. Unfriendly and insensitive market managers, rules and regulations cause great suffering amongst women who struggle to maintain their dignity, manage multiple health, safety and security risks in order to make adequate cash income to keep their family afloat.
Well, one of the constraints at the moment is the place that they are selling their produce. When they get the produce from the village or from the farm, it's really fresh. So when they come to the market, there are permanent stalls inside the building and other temporary stalls outside. And there are other spaces on the basement of the market. They are marked to sell produce. The fee paid are the same, say $3.40. If that is the case, why don't they differ the fee? Say, those who are less chance of getting a temporary stall to be less compared with when they are selling on the basement of the veranda. Most of the time, women say they are left behind in development. Especially while I work, it seems that a lady seems to be treated as a second class.
Nowhere in Fiji are rural vendors included in the existing market vendors associations, municipal markets, so their specific needs and concerns are not voiced or heard, and they have little or no access to or influence over market management.
May sanga anak ni bulia, nangkarap ni bulia. Na bondo na duru so ni kan renangon. Neka na bitu o tinga na bol salis kala kor bondo na ven laksar.
Women vendors are the majority, but not in solidarity in their struggle for better conditions. They have few male advocates. Local government leaders and administrators are not gender sensitized. They do not recognize the important role of markets in local economic development or the role of vendors in poverty prevention. They do not acknowledge that substantial daily local government revenues are collected through fees and taxes paid by vendors, mostly women. There is little or no recognition of the potential of markets or political will to change.
Ngon tu pangatena ilap na ngalampasa. Ana soli korbuli. Do tene tu korbuli tiga kengo. Gatia bungana cinga de sangabulu. Ana yang ni basa apa je tu na korongo. Sa kontene tu korbuli. Keni reki ni na ni tu palu tunggori. Sa respect bena tu palu tunggori sa gitar ton cinga de sulaba. Gosa de bela nongo sa angkas bena palu tunggori. Sona ka sayang na kena basa kerja ni labir na maram na limbasa. Di mana patut letak sampai sika. Karena pindah ke ni bahasa sarapan dalam ram. Pindah bagi sahut tinggal.
Colombia, it's home to a bounty of one of the world's most precious resources. Yet not all Colombians are getting their fair share. We travel to a remote corner of the country where an extraordinary woman is fighting for her community's very survival. In some parts of the world, it's as rare as gold. And getting hold of some, nearly impossible.
Are you going to give some of the water to the community where we live, for the school and the village?
Griselda Polanco says her community's water is being stolen.
The water that's going to be taken out of our land here, we are not able to benefit from it.
Griselda is YU, one of Colombia's largest indigenous groups, and she believes they're being discriminated against by the authorities.
I asked them to give us water for the village, for all the inhabitants of Pesuapa, and a year ago they promised they would, but until now the water hasn't arrived.
Fresh water, or YU gold as they call it, will soon be siphoned from YU lands through new pipes to a nearby town where the population are not indigenous. And Griselda will do whatever it takes to at least keep some of their water.
I want to know who is the contractor here, to talk to him, and if not, we are going to stop this work.
Such struggles for ethnic rights are repeated across the country. Recently, 10,000 representatives of indigenous groups took to the streets of the capital, Bogotá. They were demanding, among other things, their right to water. Without access to it, the very survival of many indigenous peoples is threatened. And no group more so than the YU, whose ancestral land in the northeastern La Guajira region is largely desert. Griselda's family has lived on YU land for generations. Her grandmother is anywhere between 80 and 102.
My 4 children grew up here. When I arrived, there was hardly anyone here. I came with my goats and my donkeys.
In those days, rainfall here was more frequent and food for the animals abundant. But with the changing climate, water has become ever scarcer, says Griselda's mother.
Before, there were not only dry seasons, there were wet seasons. But now, 2 years can go by without it raining.
The result, the traditional water reserves are drying up, putting 300,000 YUs across the region in jeopardy. Filled with collected rains, these reserves are their main source of water. But now they contain just a fraction of what they used to. And what's left is stagnant and almost undrinkable.
There are still people who have to drink this green water, though there are only the dregs left. But it's harmful. It gives us diarrhea. It fills the children with parasites. You can see some of the children are really thin, but they have big tummies. That's because of the water.
The problem is so bad that acute diarrhea is one of the leading killers amongst local children under 5. With no clean water left in these reservoirs, the YU have no choice but to turn to their only other source of water, taps scattered across their lands linked to underground reserves. As she does several times a day, Griselda's aunt sets off to one of the distant taps. It's noon and almost 42 degrees centigrade as she trudges through the sand. A kilometre later, she finally arrives. But the water that comes out is far from sweet.
It's from an underground spring, but it was perforated. It's now salt water.
A painful reminder, Griselda says, of the urgent need to secure safe and plentiful water for her people. And alongside Griselda, in the front line of this fight, her own sister, Orsinia. As the first indigenous woman elected to the Colombian Congress in 2006, her highest priority has always been to have water recognized as a fundamental right for all Colombians.
One of my biggest dreams, which I've always fought for and argued, is that there's water for the Wayuu people. It's the main thing I want.
But the bill she introduced in 2009 failed to pass, disappointing many.
The state has a huge responsibility to support indigenous peoples in preserving their culture.
Margarita Bueso of UN Women says the indigenous struggle for basic rights like water is especially complicated in Colombia. Decades of violent conflict over drugs and politics have taken a particularly heavy toll on ethnic communities. Too often they are the victims of massacres or tragically caught up in the crossfire between various armed groups.
It's the men who die in the confrontations between the different illegal armed groups. The women are the survivors of the conflict.
And this leaves them bearing the burden of the struggle to survive. Something made even more difficult by their dwindling water resources, says Griselda.
In order to feed ourselves, we raise animals. But at the moment, the animals are dying of hunger because there are no pastures, and they are suffering the same as we are from the lack of water.
Back at the village, much to Griselda's surprise, the chief water engineer suddenly turns up and wants to talk to her. She longs for a glimmer of hope, but he has no real answers.
What I'm going to do is look at the calculations and see if the water really can reach here.
Griselda, however, is skeptical. She believes the only reason for his visit is because of the filming.
The engineer who is in charge, when he saw you with your cameras, that was when they decided to talk and to tell us that they are going to bring water to the community. But they weren't saying this before.
If they do get some of this water, this Wayuu community's survival, at least in the short term, is assured. But if these are yet more empty promises, Griselda fears the prospects for her people are bleak.
The truth is that we will have a future if we manage to get the free water they told us they are going to give us. Without the water, we have no future.
Climate change is accelerating and impacting more and more communities around the world. The worst affected are the poorest countries, with rising sea levels, increasing temperatures, and extreme weather conditions. Within these countries, the poorest, most marginalized groups have the fewest opportunities to protect themselves. Due to discrimination and gender norms, women and men are impacted differently by climate change. In many developing countries, men work away from the home while women cultivate tiny plots of land without irrigation to produce food for their families. Climate change directly affects their ability to grow crops. On top of that, women often face barriers to basic education, employment, and to owning property. This often leaves women voiceless in advocating for climate change solutions and vulnerable to its adverse effects. By paying special attention to the different needs and contributions of men and women, gender-responsive climate finance not only addresses climate change, but also reduces gender inequalities and empowers women.
Yay!
Effective projects ensure equal benefits. Take, for example, a climate project used to fund sustainable public transport. Do women feel safe while using the system? Can they afford the fare? Does the schedule meet their specific needs? Without answering these questions, the project will not serve a large part of the population. Climate action that disregards half of the population cannot be efficient or effective. Taking women's needs into consideration is not only the right thing, but also the smart thing to do. In short, only gender-responsive climate projects can be equitable, effective, and efficient. To achieve gender-responsive climate finance, there are a number of essential steps. 1. Climate projects need to involve more women on the ground, both in consultation and in implementation. What exactly are women's needs and contributions, and how can these projects respond accordingly? For example, a project that provides women with access to renewable energy not only provides them with electricity, but also decreases their work burden in caring for families and communities. Second, climate funds need to have social and gender experts, not just technical ones. Policymakers need to look beyond the scientific and economic aspects of climate change and incorporate social and human rights dimensions as well. Third, more women should hold a seat at the table to affect the focus and the way climate decisions are made. In most climate funds, there are currently very few women holding these seats. This must change. Fourth, funds should be made directly accessible in the form of loans or grants to women's groups or female entrepreneurs working on climate action. This would empower them to be agents of change for clean energy projects. It is high time for decision makers and funding mechanisms to fully support women as important stakeholders in climate action. Over the last 10 years, advocacy groups such as the Heinrich Böll Stiftung have pushed for more recognition of the gender dimensions of climate finance. So far, there has been some success. Look at the Green Climate Fund, currently the largest multilateral climate fund, which started its operations with an explicit gender equality mandate. This is an important step and a signal to the world, even if there's still a lot of work left to do. If you want to know more about the Green Climate Fund, or the basic principles guiding climate finance and its delivery, check out our other 2 videos.
Walking there, I felt like a sensory overload. You know, it was like a sensory overload in every form I can imagine. It was the smell. Visually, it was like I can't believe people, you know, are living in these conditions. And they don't have energy, or they don't have, you know, they used to have flying toilets everywhere. It's the way that, you know, that's why it smells that way, and that's why you have, it's basically in the sewage everywhere. The government is not doing anything to get them out of that situation. They're doing it for themselves. And then they have, you know, practical action, and they just created all these amazing ways to get them out of that situation, you know. So that's the hopeful part and the amazing part. They created these centers where people can go and use their bathrooms, and they can, with that waste, they used to, you know, to create biogas, and then the biogas, they can cook with the biogas. And I love how spiritual they are, and how hopeful, and how trusting, and they're just joyous, and they're just happy, and they're focused on the solution. I don't think if you come and you give something to them, they would appreciate it as much. I think that, to me also, I mean, they have a huge sense of entrepreneurship there. You know, they want to work. I mean, they want to do. They're giving 150% all the time. They're giving their all. It's like it's so inspiring, and they're doing everything they can to find a solution. That did bring like joy to my heart. they have to walk for sometimes hours to come here and collect the wood, because without the wood they can't really feed their families, because they don't have the money to buy. There's no other option for them because they're poor and they don't have the financial. They can't afford any other way. So basically, this is their survival. Actually, today they got a couple, but they say that it's usually like 5 times as much as this, right? That you carry. All of this by yourself. There's no firewood, there is no cooking. And there is no eating. No eating. There is no eating. They have an open fire inside their house. So all the smoke is going inside of their house. I couldn't even keep my eyes open. It was burning. It was very difficult. The smell, I mean, you inhale it. You almost feel like you're suffocating. And almost 2 million women and children die every year from smoke inhalation from in-house cooking. They don't have other options until now. There is this new improved cooking stoves, and the idea with them is to improve cooking so they can use 50% less firewood and produce 70% less smoke. We were actually able to see an installation of a stove in one of the houses, and they had to break an opening in the wall, so they had a window, and they had to have a way for the smoke to get out. They spend so much of their time collecting firewood, and the stove actually uses 50% less wood. I think that's amazing, because one of the concerns I felt from the women was that they had to go so far to collect the firewood, and it's running out. There's only so many trees left. They made these fireless cookers, which were kind of like an oven. They kept things warm so they can start the cooking process on the stoves, leave it for 5 or 10 minutes depending on what they're cooking. They can put it in there, they can go to work and do whatever they need to do, and the food is kept inside and kept warm for up to 9 hours. It's really about survival, you know? I mean, they spend all day long collecting water, collecting firewood, taking care of their kids. I mean, these women, they're like Wonder Women. They're amazing. In this situation over there is like they have small little rivers or even tiny little streams, and they make it with whatever they have, you know. They put community together. They try to bring, you know, organizations from outside to see what they're doing and trying to get funding, and they've done it. There's going to be like 7,000 people who are going to be served from that. By using their natural resources, they can tap into a river which is like clean energy, you know, and they can have much better life and basically protecting the environment at the same time, because they're not burning coal, they're not using kerosene, they're not burning wood, they're not cutting down trees, you know, they're really just using a microhydro wave from a stream, from a river, which is a clean energy to, you know, support themselves and to have a better life. The main thing of electricity is that when kids have electricity, they can study. She says that a while ago they only had people that went to university from really far, like villages, and now they're so proud to say, well, there's a kid from this family that went to school and that went to university, and there's a kid from that village, you know, like, so they actually have people surrounding them that have been able to get the education, and you can see there's a pride and there's such a sense of, like, you know, we made this happen for ourselves. You know, we did it. I mean, it's amazing to see how their strength and their just their passion for, you know, changing their lives. 2 out of every 3 families live without electricity. But you go there and people are happy and they're helping each other. Again, one thing I could sense in all those villages and communities and different places we visited the strip, no matter how large or small they were, it was always a very strong sense of community and people helping one another. You know, I don't think they have any other option. There is always like a part where it's heartbreaking, but there's also a part that is so inspiring, you know, to see the strength of the people, to see their passion to get out of their life and to change. And I think I'm just leaving this trip and I'm feeling completely so grateful to have had this experience, so grateful for my life, you know, to have what I have. I mean, you don't realize that when you go home, you know, you turn on a switch and the light goes on and you flush the toilet and it's gone, you know, and here, like, people are living in I mean, they're just happy to have one lamp so the kids can study, you know, and then maybe a radio, and, you know, it's a really hard reality.
আইলার পরে ওই যে নোনা জল এসে ঢুকে মানে আমাদের এসব বাড়ি ঘর ধরে জল উঠেছিল খুব, মানে কোনো খন্দবাড়ি হতো না, ওই বিলি ধানও লাগাতে পারতাম না। আইলার পরে ভীষণ অবস্থা ছিল তখন। আমার স্বামী তখন ওই কী করে, হাসি একজোটে যারা ওরা থাকতো একসাথে, তারা ওই ঢাকায় যাওয়া আসা করতো।
Poverty levels are very high, and with the changing climate and resulting loss of income-earning opportunities, migration is often seen as the only means to earn a living in the southwest of Bangladesh. Women and men are affected differently by migration. Most often, male family members migrate and the women stay behind.
আইলার 10-20 দিনের পরে গিয়ে তারপরে এই জায়গায় আইছি, এখানে ভিটি আর ঘের একতা হয়ে গেছে, ভিটির করে কোনো মাটি নেই, আমাদের জায়গা নেই, জমি নেই, তোমার যত সময় খাটাখাটনি করবো সাত সময় তো খাবো, বাচ্চা কাছে খাওয়াবার জন্য বিদেশে আমার স্বামী তোমার আয় রোজগার করতে যায়।
The male members of the family travel to cities near and far for periods of 3 to 6 months in search of work. Some struggle to find work, suffer from illnesses or injuries, and often cannot send money back to their families. Firoza Begum's husband has returned to the village after falling ill.
বিদেশে গেলে দেখা যাচ্ছে সবসময় যে আমার কাজটা হয় তা হয় না, রাস্তায় 1 সপ্তাহ পর্যন্ত না খাইয়েও দিন চলে যায়। যখন এইভাবে বিদেশে অসুখ বিসুখ হয় তখন বাড়িতেও টাকা পয়সা পাঠাতে পারি না, তখন বাড়ি এদের খুব কষ্ট হয়।
Like Firoza and her husband, Minoti is also trying to manage her family in the absence of her husband.
বাচ্চা কাচ্চা হয়ে গেছে, তাদের একটু লেখাপড়া শেখাতে হবে, এই কারণে আমার বাইরেও খাটাখাটনি করতে হয়। দেখা যাচ্ছে মাটির কাজ, যেখানে যে কাজ পাই ছেলাবাসি, আবার মাটি কাজ করি। দেখা যাচ্ছে কেউ যদি বাড়ি ডাকে যে কচুর গোড়া বাঁধতে হবে, গোড়া বাঁধি দেয়। কেউ যদি বলে যে আমার এই ঘর লিপে দিতে হবে, ঘর লিপে দেয়। এমনকি মানুষ যদি বলে পায়খানাগুলো কাটিয়ে দিতে হবে, টাকা দেবো, তাও গরিব মানুষ আমাদের করতে হবে। স্বামী যখন বাইরে থাকে তখন দেখা যাচ্ছে বাচ্চা কাচ্চার পড়াশুনো বা রোগ ব্যাধি, খাওয়া দাওয়া সমস্ত ঝামেলা আমার মাথায় নিতে হয়, আমার সামলাতে হয়।
These are some of the voices from the front line, the women and men confronted with the realities of climate-induced migration.